Uh, Social movement. A social movement refers to an actual liberation and vitalization of social being that arises in response to a ricochet of authentic mutual recognition across a group's psycho-spiritual field. The force of a movement results from the emergence of mutual presence triggered by the rotating recognition of that presence, a kind of existential chain reaction. As I use the term, true social movements are inherently good because they're in their very movement, they dissolve the fear-induced separation that is at the heart of the world's problems. The hyper-excitement of reactionary upheavals like Nazism are not true movements, but rather paranoid inflations of the collective outer self, coupled with a parallel intensification of demonization of another conceived as a threat to that inflated outer self. So in a true social movement, the whole society can become, as I've described elsewhere in this, throughout the glossary really, up for grabs because a new force enters into the space between us that is livelier, more spiritually alive, more heartfelt, more creative, that can introduce itself into social space. And the fixed character of Ozzie and Harriet and everybody playing his or her role within a script can begin to dissolve. New possibilities can form, people can form new ways of life and begin to form a new society right inside the existing society. As I've said, that is what happened in my younger years in the 1960s for a long time. Certainly wasn't perfect. That's not the point. The point was something arose, or the civil rights movement is a great, beautiful example of the Black community coming out of those Black churches, which were so evocative through gospel singing, through call and response preaching, through the religious spiritual tradition of community created in those churches as resistance churches, really, as resistance to slavery and to the outside world's oppression. Out of those churches came a new force of people ricocheting into connection with one another, being brought out into the world, challenging the injustice of the world. And it was the force of if you think of Dr. King, of Martin Luther King, the force of this, the spiritual force of what came out of that resistance and that spiritual environment, that hurled a moral imperative into the Ozzie and Harriet wider world, the fixed character of the racialized, unjust world, and forced it to dissolve right in front of itself because of the connecting, the deep ontological or at the level of being sense of presence that was conveyed, moral presence that was conveyed in that movement's opposition to the way things were. Social movement a true social movement brings that ricochet of mutuality and of depth of being into the separation space of the more alienated world, and as I've said, tends to emulsify that alienated world or dissolve it. Because remember, the alienated world is empty. It is in denial of its own deepest longing. So it's not like it's substantial. It's actually quite insubstantial, but very difficult to overcome. It's in denial of its own deepest longing. So when you speak to that deepest longing through all the defenses that form the rotation of the alienated world, it tends to crack and emulsify. It can't sustain itself. Whereas if you just violently attack it or try and smash it. It can sustain itself for a time. So the social movement is a great vehicle of transformation because it is how being itself, our social being itself, can redeem itself through action. That's why the subtitle of the book is Social Movements and the Dissolution of the False Self. Okay, next.